Hello and welcome again to the second part of the lecture which we were discussing, that is Forest Society and Colonialism. I am Ashwin Joglikar from Resonance PCCP division. So let us continue with our next part of the chapter. Now, as we had seen earlier that how colonialism had affected the lives of forest people in different ways, and mostly it was negative, that is their trading or their cultivation or their hunting, everything they had lost, and even they also suffered at the hands of the forest guards and other people. So now what will this situation lead to? Definitely there were rebellions in and around the country asking for their basic rights, that is the forest people wanted their basic rights to be restored to them. Now, as we had seen last year in your class 8th probably, if you reconnect, that is tribal decus and the vision of a golden age. In that also there was a talk about Birsa Munda. Similarly, now here also we will be discussing rebellion in the forest, and later on we will take up we will discuss about Java, that is forest transformations in Java. Now, rebellion in the forest. In many parts of India and across the world, the forest communities rebelled against the changes that were being imposed on them. The leaders of these movements against the British, like Sidhu and Kanu in the Santhal Parganas, Birsa Munda of Chota Nagpur, or Alluri Sitaram Raju of Andhra Pradesh, are still remembered today in songs and stories. Now, the people of Bastar. Bastar is again located in the southernmost part of Chhattisgarh and borders of Andhra Pradesh, Odisha and Maharashtra. A number of different communities live in Bastar, such as Maria and Muria Gonds, Dhurvas, Bhatras and Halbas. The tribal people had formulated strict rules and regulations about how to manage their own forest and use the forest. They believed that each village was given its land by the earth, and in return they had to look after the earth by making some offerings at each agriculture festival. Since each village knew its boundary or knows where its boundaries are lie, the local people look after the natural resources within that boundary. Now, if the people from a particular village want to take something from another village, they could take it, but then they had to pay some thing for it. That is, if people from a village want to take some wood from the forest of another village, they pay a small fee called Devsari, Dand or Man in exchange. Some villages also protected their forest by engaging watchmen. Now, the fears of the people, why these people rose in revolt. Now, in 1905, when the British government proposed to increase the area under the reserve forest, that is proposed to reserve 2/3 of the forest to stop shifting cultivation, hunting and collection of forest produce. The people of Bastar were very worried. For long, villagers had been suffering from increased land rents and frequent demands of free labour, that is system of begar, and goods by colonial officials. Then came the terrible famines in 1899 and 1900, and again in 1907 and 1908. Reservation proved to be the last straw. The initiative was taken up by the Dhurvas of the Kangar forest, from where it started, where reservation first took place. Although there was no particular single leader, but many people speak of Gundadhur from village Nithanar as an important figure in the movement. In 1910, mango boughs, a lump of earth and chilies and arrows began circulating between villages as a symbol of to take part in this revolt or rebellion. These were actually messages inviting villagers to rebel against the Britishers. Every village contributed something for this cause to the rebellion expenses. Bazaars were looted, the houses of officials and traders were again, and schools and police stations were burned and robbed, and again the grain which was collected was redistributed among the people. Most of those who were attacked were in some way or the other related to the state and its oppressive laws. Now, the British, they sent troops to suppress the rebellion, and the Adivasi leaders tried to negotiate, but the British surrounded their camps and opened fire. After that, they marched through the village, flogging, beating up and punishing all those who were involved or taken part in the rebellion. Most villagers deserted the villages because of fear and fled into jungles. It took 3 months for the British to regain control. However, they never managed to capture Gundadhur. But in a major victory for the rebels, work on the reservation was postponed and temporarily suspended, and the area to be reserved was again reduced to roughly half of which was planned. That is, earlier it was planned of 2/3, now it was reduced before 1910. The revolt also inspired other tribal people to rise up against these policies. That is, other tribal people to rebel against the unjust policies of the British government. Then, moving on to the next part, that is forest transformations in Java. Now, similarly, like in India, Britishers were the colonial power. In Indonesia, Dutch were the colonial power, and how they transformed the lives there is also a part of this chapter. That is, Java in Indonesia is where the Dutch started forest management. Like the British, they also wanted timber for from Java to build ships. In 1600, the population of Java was an estimated 3.4 million. There were many villages in the fertile plains, but there were also many communities living in mountains and practicing shifting cultivation. Now, the woodcutters of Java, that is the Kalangs of Java, were a community of skilled forest cutters and shifting cultivators. Now, when the Dutch began to gain control over the forest in the 18th century, they tried to make the Kalangs work under them. In 1770, the Kalangs resisted by attacking a Dutch fort at Joanna, but the uprising was suppressed. Even about Kalangs, that is when Mataram kingdom was divided, the Kalang people were divided as a property. Like when there is a division of property between the family members, there is an equal division of property. So, similarly, Kalangs was like a resource to these people, and that is the Mataram kingdom which was there when it was divided. So, even exact number of Kalangs were given to the first one and the second one. Later on, moving to Dutch scientific forestry. So, as Britishers had practiced their way of scientific forestry, Dutch also practiced their way of scientific forestry here. Now, the Dutch enacted forest laws in Java, restricting villagers' access to forest. Now, wood could only be cut for specified purposes only from specific forests under close supervision. So, everything was regulated. Villagers were punished for grazing cattle in young stands, transporting wood without a permit, or travelling on forest roads with horse carts or cattle. The Dutch first imposed rents on land being cultivated in the forest, and then exempted some villages. Why? Because they wanted free labor from the rent on the land if they worked collectively to provide free labor and buffaloes for cutting and transporting of timber. Now, this system was known as Blandong-Dynstein system. Later, instead of rent exemption, forest villages were given some small wages, but their right to cultivate forest land was still restricted. Now, here Surantiko Samin rose up in challenge, and that is what Samin's challenge. Around 1890, Surantiko Samin of Randub Latung village, a teak forest village, began questioning state ownership of the forest. He began to question that it's not the state which has created the earth, the air, the water. So, how could they charge a tax from us on that? And later on, he was joined by a lot of followers. He argued that the state had not created the wind, water, earth and wood, so it could not own it. Soon a widespread movement developed. Amongst those who helped organize it were also Samin's son-in-laws. By 1907, 3,000 families were following his ideas. Some of the Saminists protested by lying down on their land when the Dutch came to inspect it or survey it, while others refused to pay taxes or fines or perform any kind of free labor. Now, war and deforestation. Now, during the war times, again forest resources were recklessly utilized for the war efforts. The First World War and the Second World War had a major impact on forest in India. Working plants were abandoned, and at this time the forest department cut trees freely to meet British war needs. In Java also, the Dutch destroyed sawmills because later on during Second World War, as Japanese forces were advancing, so they did not, the Dutch did not want anything to be left for the Japanese. So they followed a scorched earth policy, that is, they burned down everything and burned piles of giant teak logs so that they would not fall into Japanese hands. Later on, the Japanese then exploited the forest recklessly, whatever was left out, for their own war industries, forcing forest villagers to cut down forest. Many villagers later on used this opportunity to expand their areas, and later on forest department had a hard time in getting those back. Used this opportunity to expand cultivation in the forest, and after the war it was difficult for the Indonesian forest services to get this land back. Finally, new developments in forestry, that is, conservation of forest rather than collecting timber has become a more important goal. The government has recognized that in order to meet this goal, the people who live near the forest have to be included or made part of this, or must be involved. In many cases across India also, from Mizoram to Kerala, many of these natural forest resources have survived because of this. Dense forests have survived only because villages or villagers have protected them in sacred groves known as Sarnas, Devarakudu, Kan, Rai, etc. Some villages have been patrolling their own forest, which with each household taking it in turns, instead of leaving it to the forest guards. Local forest communities and environmentalists today are thinking of different ways or forms of forest management. So now this brings us to the end of this chapter. Thank you so much.